Can everybody make sure they mute? All right, Shannon, it's all yours.
Yes, thank you, David. It's a pleasure for me to, at long last, be able to introduce Michael Hathaway to Svims. We have tried for quite a while now. COVID has gotten in the way of a few times of Michael's presentation to the club. So yay, we finally made it. So Michael is a university professor at Simon Fraser University. He has a PhD from the University of Michigan. He is a professor of anthropology and director of SFU's David Lamb Center for the Asia Pacific. And he's also editor-in-chief, along with a co-editor of an anthropology journal called American Ethnologist. I first met Michael, I think, many, many years ago when I did a presentation over at Vancouver Mycological Society. And then I got to know him a lot better when we both attended I think it was the 10th International Workshop on Edible Mycorrhizal Mushrooms and Truffles in Japan in 2019. And that was my really first eye-opening introduction to how anthropology and mycology interconnect. So since then, I had the honor of being one of the people to take a look at the manuscript for Michael's book that is coming out, I think it says here in the spring, so that's wonderful, through Princeton University Press. What a Mushroom Lives For, Matsutake and the Worlds They Make. So I got to tell you, reading this manuscript just kind of scrambled my mind in a really positive way, got me looking at the world quite differently. So I look forward very much, Michael, to your presentation to us tonight.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Shannon. Let me just see if I can share my screen with you guys, and then I will get started. I'm so glad to be here with you tonight. And I want to start with an acknowledgement that where I'm coming from, where I'm zooming from, in what is now Vancouver, this is the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I've been an uninvited guest on these beautiful lands for some time. And I am slowly starting to learn more about the ongoing history of colonialism, the massive time span before colonization, and to think more about Indigenous futures that can foster a better way of life for all beings on this land, humans and non-humans alike. So we've heard already that the rains have been prolific, and I'm very happy to be part of this mushroom-loving network of friends and colleagues, all enjoying a great fall harvest. And I want to offer special thanks to David Waldy for arranging this talk, and to Shannon Birch for suggesting my name and for introducing me tonight. And as she said, we got to really spend some time together, great time in Japan. And I had met her briefly before and read a number of her really innovative papers on fungi and forests, and it was great fun to spend some time there. And there we met a German filmmaker, I want to say that that was there, Marion Newman, whose film just came out called The Mushroom Speaks, which I just saw, and I highly recommend it. And I don't know if you've seen it yet, Shannon and others, but she mentions you for your help in gaining a better understanding of fungi. So in fact, in reflecting back on the land acknowledgement, the teachings of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh have informed my own role as a cultural anthropologist by thinking more deeply about all our relations beyond the strictly human. So once I was introduced to a Japanese American farmer who loved to hunt mushrooms, and he was told that I was an anthropologist who studied mushrooms, and he was surprised. He said, "What, an anthropologist? Are mushrooms people now?" But so this is part of this more kinship related thinking that has inflected my own participation in one of anthropology's collectives called the Matsutake Worlds Research Group. For over a decade, 6 of us have been studying this enigmatic Matsutake mushroom, often known here in BC as the pine mushroom, which is the English translation of the Japanese word. So as probably many of you know, Matsutake is one of the most valuable mushrooms in the world. And despite heroic efforts by many amazing scientists working in sophisticated laboratories and spending millions of dollars, this mushroom has so far resisted all attempts at cultivation. In my own role in this group, I have been leading the research in China, mainly working with Tibetan and Yi peoples up in the Himalayas in Southwest China, the world's most important site in a global trade now worth billions of dollars. So I'm not sure if any of you have had the opportunity yet to read the first book in our group's trilogy, Anna Singh's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. And I hope you do, and I hope you find it to be as amazing as I do. At last count, it was translated into 9 languages and won a heap of awards. And as Shannon mentioned, tonight's talk is loosely based on some parts of my own book here. And tonight, I'm not going to tell you stories about China, but I will focus more on issues that I raised in the first half of my book, a bit more philosophical. I will look at a few terms, such as agency, anthropocentrism, and animal-centrism, and briefly share some thoughts on these. Okay, so first, let's think about agency. Sometimes agency is defined in very strict terms as self-directed action with conscious intent by an individual. In this kind of definition, it is often seen as a capacity that only humans possess. As we know, the idea of actions and intent is very often important within the legal realm, and we often distinguish between intended and unintended effects. Agency, however, can also be understood in a far looser way as an effect on the world that others can perceive. And some forms of agency are much easier to see than others. For instance, in one of my earlier projects in China, I researched how wild elephants were affecting the lives of rural villagers. The government had just confiscated thousands of villagers' guns, and the elephants in turn began what some people thought of as revenge, attacking people, their dogs, and even destroying homes. It was fairly easy to understand these elephants were shaping human lives. These could be seen as fairly obvious forms of elephant agency. But then when I turned to studying Matsutake in China, it was a really different animal, so to speak. It was much harder to imagine how one Matsutake might affect the world. It might make one little part of a meal, make a bit of money, or if it was over mature, make someone a bit sick. Yet as I read more, I began to see how as individuals and as a collective kingdom, fungi have fantastic powers that shape the planet. And there's a term called cumulative agency that looks not at individuals carrying out individual actions, but at groups acting over time. It can therefore be both dispersed and accumulative. And I find this concept helpful in understanding fungal agency in the world. So I'll mention just 3 kinds of cumulative fungal agency, things that many people in this group know about, but are not always thought of in terms of fungal agency. So first, creating underground mycorrhizal networks. Second, the complex roles of endophytic fungi. And third, fungi's ability to decompose wood. So in the first example, creating mycorrhizal networks, we now know that huge numbers of plants on Earth are connected with underground fungi. And some of these networks in turn are able to mine vast amounts of minerals from the soil, helping turn inaccessible nutrients into plant tissue, as well as gather fantastic quantities of water that plant roots are unable to suck out of the earth. They are not just conveyors of minerals and water up into plant tissue, but in exchange, they receive large quantities of photosynthetic sugars from plants that fungi then use to build their bodies and carry out their activities. Second, endophytic fungi are the fungi that live within almost all plant tissues, such as within leaves. And this realm has become big news in the last few decades. It turns out that they are often playing key roles within plants, producing a wide range of chemicals that are able to help plants fight off attacks by insects, bacteria, and other fungi. And these chemicals are called secondary metabolites. And it turns out that the anti-cancer properties in our yew trees were produced by endophytic fungi living within the yew needles. These fungi also make volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. In other words, things that we and other organisms can smell. This fungal capacity was only documented in 2001, so we still have a lot more to learn. My third example, fungi's amazing ability to decompose cellulose and lignin, or otherwise known as woody material, is, I think, often underrated and underappreciated. Hundreds of millions of years ago, before plants had invented these substances, they could not really grow tall on their own accord. These are complex structures and were at first incredibly resistant to decomposition. Yet over time, fungi figured out how to disassemble them, to turn them into food and gain nutrients from cellulose and lignin. Many of us think of a tree rotting as a passive activity. Instead, we can also think of how a range of fungi are actively digesting its tissues together with many other organisms, turning it back into organic, rich soil. It was my interest in fungal agency that prompted me to think of decomposing as more active than passive, as requiring all sorts of activities by fungi moving through the wood, encountering others, secreting a range of chemicals that can break down different tissues, and selectively absorbing these broken down substances into its body. So these are just a few examples of the everyday activities of fungi, extending their reach in soil and creating vast networks connecting multiple species of plants, living with leaves and actively responding to the changing environment, and breaking down living and dead plants into soil. I find that these actions are not always appreciated as lively activities. Fungi are often downplayed within a scientific education. And I was interested to read that it took a partnership with a mycologist to add the role of fungi into some of our climate change models. The role of plants and cycling carbon has been part of these models since the beginning, but adding in the role of fungi has only been recent. So a few more key terms for tonight are anthropocentrism and animal-centrism. The first, let's go back. The first means human-centered, and there are different forms this can take. In one form, it implies that we think of the world always in relation to human health and human well-being. For example, when I was trying to do research on the fungal immune system, almost every single search result I got was about how mushrooms as medicines can affect human immune systems. It was really hard to find out details about the immune systems of various fungi and how they respond to others, such as insects, other fungi, bacteria, and viruses. For most of us, we are deeply schooled in an anthropocentric way of understanding the world. The term natural resources, for instance, is an example of such a term, for it converts the sockeye salmon swimming home to spawn, the old growth western red cedar, and the waters of the Capilano River from living beings and sources of life into pounds of food, board feet of timber, and units of water, all as objects of human consumption. We can also see forms of anthropocentrism in the way that we often conflate the world as we perceive it with the world as it is. For example, what we call visible light means the spectrum of light that human eyes can perceive. Ultrasonic refers to the spectrum of sound waves beyond the range of human ears. All of these neutral sounding concepts would be different if they were being described by other organisms. Likewise, in terms of eating mushrooms, what we call a choice delicacy, an edible or poisonous mushroom, might be quite different from the vantage point of a red squirrel or a banana slug. And sometimes what we call anthropocentrism is more animal-centrism. This isn't yet an established word, but I find it helpful. And as I will soon explain, there are lingering issues of animal-centered ways of classifying the world. If you look at most biology textbooks, there are far more examples of animals than there are plants, fungi, or other kingdoms of life. It is not just that are these different amounts of attention to different kingdoms, there are subtle ways in which animal-centrism is expressed. One of these is in the classification of plants as producers and animals as consumers in ways that describe plants as primarily a source of food for animals, rather than existing in their own right, or recognizing how they too are consuming sunlight, water, and soil nutrients. Both studies of fungi and plants have been subject to this animal bias. And when I tried to learn about fungal abilities to sense the world, I could find very few general writings on the topic. So I started to delve into the more plentiful studies done by plants. Okay, so Daniel Chamovitz's wonderful book, What a Plant Knows, had some interesting things to say about animal bias and how this may affect studies of the senses. For example, he points out that many definitions of senses were premised on certain animal bodies. Seeing was based on eyes, smelling on noses, and hearing on ears. He asked instead, how might we think about these senses in terms of plant bodies? By necessity, we have to define these differently, not based on animals. And by reframing the definition, Chamovitz provides a careful analysis of how plants react to the world around them. He shows how they are detecting chemicals in the air, soil, or water. They're moving in relation to the presence and qualities of light, or even detecting colors. This also includes how plants can sometimes distinguish the presence of certain chemicals in the saliva of insects that land on them and bite them, allowing plants to react selectively in a defensive way to some insects and not to others. Where some abilities might be widespread among different plants, I was also interested to see that some capacities might differ substantially between plant species. And we know less about fungal senses, but these experiments in plants are helping to foster more related work on fungal abilities. So the study, let me get this, of how plants sense the world is also related to questions of plant action and movement. Plants are often described as sessile, as unmoving, but we can also appreciate how they extend their roots and their shoots. In the city, trees buckle sidewalks and invade drain pipes, create shady streets, and some attract organisms. For example, linden trees appeal to aphids, which in turn secrete a kind of sticky honeydew, much to the chagrin of some car owners. While plants don't move in the same ways as many animals, I am less sure of the binary between sessile plants and mobile animals. As extending this issue to fungi, it is really interesting to think of the many kinds of fungal movement. Fungal mobilities are diverse. The growing mycelia, forging connections with plant roots, snaring nematodes with sticky snare traps, building fruiting bodies, and shooting spores off microscopic launching pads. Fungal movement is interesting and enigmatic. On the one hand, it is so quick, as we have the seemingly magical appearance of tiny mushrooms on a lawn that appear from nowhere overnight, where they don't even seem to grow, but just pop. On the other hand, when you look at a mushroom, it seems so still, not even moving with the breeze, but inside so much is happening. There is so much power and speed within sporulating fruiting bodies, invisible and inaudible to humans. Inside the gills, spores are shot out with a force that would kill any astronaut. And yet, because of the properties of air resistance at that tiny scale, the spore's trajectory slows so quickly that they then float down between the gills. Imagine for a moment if mushrooms were gigantic. What if we could see their internal water-powered catapults and they had spores the size of basketballs? And this would be a phenomenon to reckon with. The sound might be deafening. Of course, though, changing the scale changes everything. And so at this large size, these fungi would become quite different things. So perhaps it'd be more interesting for us to shrink on a radical scale. More recently, there seems increased cultural openness towards a more expansive sense of agency and a less anthropocentric view of life, as exemplified by some popular books. For instance, Richard Powers' recent Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Overstory, has trees that can be considered as characters. And also the New York Times bestseller, The Hidden Lives of Trees, uses human-based metaphors to understand tree behavior. Such human analogies are a form of anthropomorphism, and he talks of trees as investing in their bank accounts and feeling love. Although this is typically not part of my own writing strategy, I can find such metaphors helpful as a thought experiment. Forms of anthropomorphism frustrate some scientists who correctly point out that such metaphors might simplify or misrepresent the lives of trees. Indeed, they can foster a kind of human-centeredness by thinking that trees are just like us. On the other hand, one can also argue that books like The Hidden Lives of Trees have really inspired the wider public to better appreciate trees and to learn more. We can also see animal metaphors in the work of Suzanne Simard, especially her term, the mother tree. Although often described as anthropomorphic, the notion of motherhood could be applied to almost any animal species, not just humans. The term may surprise us, as we often haven't been taught to see plants as mothering. Instead, many of us were taught to see plants as competing for sunlight, space, nutrients, and water. Within Western thinking, though, trees have been the subject of a lot of romance, and it has historically been rare to have as much social positivity associated with mushrooms, let alone to have many people have a deep interest in their hidden lives. Fungi haven't gotten nearly as much attention as that of trees or other plants, but through the work of Simard and others like Paul Stamets and Merlin Sheldrake, new audiences might see fungi and trees as equally wondrous. In part, this historic blind spot toward mushroom might stem from mycophobia, a fear of mushrooms and a tendency to ignore their importance, as exemplified by the fact I just mentioned about how fungi were a critical missing factor in climate change models. So in sum, I am hopeful that this fear of fungi or lack of interest is finally beginning to change, and that this is connected to a larger questioning of human-centered frameworks. Films such as the one I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, The Mushroom Speaks, and others like Fantastic Fungi and CBC documentaries, as well as books like this one, both document and inspire the rapid growth of the DIY mushroom movement, which encourages new ways to create strong relationships with fungi. Interest is rising, and there is a sense that motivated amateurs are actively networking and fostering new forms of knowledge that are less mired in the anthropocentric frameworks of the past. They are building creative alliances between different people and other organisms. So it's exciting to watch and be a part of this. And in this regard, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to your organization. Thank you. And I look forward to more questions and discussion.
Sorry, I'm here. I just forgot to unmute myself. And anyway, if you want to ask a question, please press the pause button and ask the question holding down the pause button. There's a lot that was covered in Michael's talk. Michael, thank you very much. I don't see, I saw one, I'm looking at the chat box.
Sinclair has a question.
Go ahead,
I do. I'm known for my sarcasm. Kevin Trim in our club always tells us that mushrooms speak to him, call out to him. My ears are not that good, but and this is sort of tongue in cheek, but should there be a political representation for mushrooms? I'm up at Fairy Creek, perhaps you know what's going on there. as there is for animals?
That's an interesting question. And I mean, you could think of all forms of conservation, especially around like endangered species legislation, as a kind of voice for that animal in some ways. And I have friends that are working hard to expand the realm of conservation to really put fungi on the map. As you probably know, like if you look at the red list of endangered species, the number of fungi species is far less than 1% of the total of almost all animals, but is still like a growing number of plants. And I think too, what's interesting in terms of that, one of the angles is that gaining that knowledge about population levels and monitoring that and endangerment of different fungal species is just so incredibly difficult, especially when they're, mycelial underground and only fruiting in these, kind of often unpredictable ways. I think it's an interesting question to say, how would that kind of like the very animal or plant-based framework of looking at populations, and how would you apply that to the fungal world? There is a little bit of work, I think, more in Scandinavia that I've heard of that's pretty interesting about how these hyper-managed forests are finding that they're starting to lose a lot of their saprotrophs, that are otherwise decomposing all of their dead wood because they have so little dead wood. And so there is some kind of more intensive effort to both like catalog the diversity of species that are in the forest and to start kind of being concerned for them. But it's such a hard thing, as you can imagine, for so many species. That's a great question.
Kem, did you want to say something? Kem has said, I suppose you could use zoocentrism, yes, a word, in place of animal centrism.
Sure. Yeah.
It'd be zoocentrism. Yeah, well, just to be consistent with the Greek, that actually is a word, zoocentrism. It's often used more about the moral status of animals, but it is sometimes used more broadly the way you use animal centrism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it'd be interesting to see it being used in other realms outside of the moral status. So is that more around the kind of privileging of animals as compared to others in terms of moral rights, Ken? Is that what the context is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And once you start asking those moral questions, that is, broken from a zoocentrist one, and often a highly ranked one, so that ranking humans far above rats, etc., then you start getting into interesting territory. So there was, I think, in Austria, there was talk about having the moral rights of plants as part of their convention, which created this huge hullabaloo among a number of botanists who are trying to think through about extending the question of extending any ethical or moral rights to plant beings. And I haven't yet heard that being extended to fungi, but yeah, you're right. There is that term. It would be interesting to see the range of it. And one of the very few scholars I've seen that really had a nice critique of the zoocentrism in scientific textbooks was a French botanist who was talking about it. But I'd like to see it in other realms. See it expanded.
I'm curious, what is it that makes Matsutake so interesting to you as opposed to any other edible mushroom?
Yeah, I guess in part because of the diversity of different worlds that it seems to generate, that I've been exposed to. So I've done this work on the edge of the Tibetan plateau been, going back and forth there since 1995, and just seeing how, for example, with Tibetan people, what it's done to change their lives compared to neighboring Han villagers, and very, very different ramifications. And so the idea that you could have this one species that, we typically just see as a commodity, and, the Han Chinese were thinking, oh, okay, once Tibetans get rich, they'll become just like us, and how that's so not the case. And about how, for example, like when people devoted themselves to Matsutake, it radically transformed their relationships to yaks and yak herding. And so some people even sold off yak herds that had, basically been in the family for, millennia as a kind of heritage, and then how then that transforms landscape. So I ended up just being so, I'm sure there are a lot of different mushroom species that if one looks closely, you just see all these kinds of interesting things emerge. But for me, it was just like, one element was how neighboring groups were so radically transformed. Another one was how, like in Southwest China, this became such a huge part of the economy. And so you got to see wide scale efforts to try to maintain its growth. And there became worries that the forest was no longer going to keep producing Matsutake. And so the Bureau of Forestry got involved to try to figure out how to maintain its productivity, and invited Japanese experts. It's created so much wide scale ramifications, but so that's been really interesting.
There's a question here from Adolf Cheska. Michael, do you eat mushrooms?
Yes, I do. Love mushrooms.
There's another question here. Were there any species that humans have learned to cultivate by watching animals or other creatures cultivate them? Mm-hmm. Anything being successfully cultivated by humans that surprised you? Please do.
That's really interesting. And in terms of watching other animals, that's a really interesting a question. And I wonder if, for example, like, the termites that cultivate all the fungi, people certainly harvest them from when they pop up through the nest, but I'm curious if people are studying other animals to think about cultivation techniques. We certainly watch other animals to help us find them, which is really interesting. Like we see sometimes the blood of elk on the snow when they're pulling for the Matsutake in Oregon, or the truffle hunters are so good at seeing the flies that are buzzing above the underground truffles, or using the dogs or the pigs or things like that. But in terms of cultivation, I have not heard of that, but I would love to know if that's true. And then in terms of cultivation, I personally love that Matsutake is just so incredibly persnickety to try to cultivate, and that a number of Japanese scientists say that it would actually be such a tragedy if they were able to be successful, that the idea of having tons and tons of Matsutake would radically change what it was, would make it qualitatively different. So I'm curious about that. Certainly, it's interesting to see the cultivation of morels, and I don't know a whole lot about it, but coming out of China, and in maybe a different way than is part of our typical assumptions about the life cycle of morels. And so I'm curious about those kind of plasticity of different species and their ability to kind of move through a life cycle. And certainly a lot of work on how we used to, I think, think that mushrooms were a certain type of thing, like a mycorrhizal or saprotrophic, and now we understand more how certain species can transform over time. So that's really interesting. Yeah, and in terms of other small aspects of cultivation, I love how some people, have a big bin of their junk mail, and they use that to then feed mushrooms that they're growing. So the mushrooms are consuming their junk mail, or people are figuring out, for example, how to extend the range of the dietary possibilities of mushrooms, such as eating cigarette butts or plastic or oil, things like that. So.
Shannon, you had a question?
Yes, well, it's partly comment and partly, I guess, question. I was at a truffle cultivation Congress in California last week, and after a day and a half of meetings with people talking about like everything from the basic biology and taxonomy and molecular biology and root pruning and tree pruning and irrigation, and suddenly into my mind popped Michael, and I just thought, okay, now who's in charge here? Like, we have people around the world scurrying about to cultivate this truffle fungus. So, it's like the fungus has said, I want to move around the world and I want you to help me have sex. It was just, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, it is amazing how much these fungi are moving us, how much we're changing big areas of land, how much we're devoting our lives to it. I mean, it's so fantastic, and doing it deliberately. And then I love how they figured out in Pacific Northwest, now they have the drones that are looking for abandoned Christmas tree plantations, right? So it's like something that used to be like a great desired investment opportunity, but turned out to be a perfect home for truffles to kind of multiply in these ways. Yeah. So like some of like Michael Pollan's books have been interested too, about kind of maybe switching the idea of like the movement of corn, the movement of wheat, and kind of unseating this idea that humans are fully kind of in control of it all and acting. And so it is interesting to think of more of that. So was anybody else kind of mentioning that at the conference, or kind of more like, let's get those truffles going?
Yeah, no. And honestly, I didn't mention it. I just thought
Yeah.
they already have enough to deal with,
Yeah,
blow their minds to,
Yeah.
No.
Joey, do you want to say anything about the endophytes?
Sorry, in what way, David?
What was covered in the talk by Michael, the endophyte, pervasiveness, and the odors, the antifungal, all the secondary metabolites.
Yeah, there's a lot of work now going on looking at the secondary metabolites of endophytes, especially with respect to like bioprospecting for pharmaceuticals and biocontrol. There's a few offhand, I can't remember the names. I think like antiviral and other compounds where historically they were thought of as being plant derived. So I think that also includes the one from you. The one I'm trying to I think it's podophylotoxin or something. It's from mayapple, but it was thought of as being something derived from the plant tissue. And they would even they would grow the plant in exenic cell culture. They would get these compounds, but then they also found it occurring in endophytes of that same plant, which I think is pretty compelling evidence that it's sort of a parallel production of these compounds. And I guess one of the theories would be that an endophyte would be sort of pre-adapted to basically coming into contact and being able to tolerate these compounds, these potentially toxic compounds produced by the plant, and then they'd also be able to produce it. So if you're able to produce a toxin, you're able to tolerate it. So it's probably not a coincidence that these things are being selected. But yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff. And I think the literature, it's every year it's getting more and more. And I think people are really looking at endophytes as being big producers of potentially, industrially significant compounds.
Mhm.
The taxanes at the moment, for decades now, have been in use. And when I was in practice as a medical oncologist, it's one of the, or its derivatives were used almost on a daily basis by many patients.
Mm.
But I had a great growth of taxane use. And in my camp in Northern Ontario, we had 265 acres there, and they were covered in yew plants. And one year I turned up and they had all been taken,
Oh,
all been poached, every
Right.
one of them, because they were selling them for extraction of taxanes, which then the pharmaceutical companies modified with side chains for varying benefits.
This was in Northern Ontario, David?
Yeah.
Oh, I've never heard of that happening. the
Yeah, in
poaching.
the
I thought that was
Sioux.
just the West Coast.
Me too.
No, in the Sioux.
Oh, wow.
The other thing is that Shannon made a comment that Anna Singh's book was gifted by her to the Svims library.
Oh, great.
And if anybody wants to borrow it, please contact Jeff. I don't think they can all see you, Jeff. So if you just say a couple of words, you'll have to check your, all the lists that you have. I may even have it downstairs.
I don't think you've got the book, David. I think I've got it because Shannon brought it to me directly, and
Great.
it should still be here. In fact, I can probably see it across my room right now because I'm not going to lie, I checked it out for a little bit there, and after this talk, I'm probably going to finish it now. So whoever wants to borrow it has to read it after me.
Michael, it would be much appreciated if you made a list of the books that you mentioned.
Sure.
And we'll put it on the recording, when we set that up.
Yeah.
And that would be much appreciated.
Mhm.
Anybody else got any questions? If not, Michael, I'd like to thank you for that very thought-provoking presentation. It's something that we really have to play back 2 or 3 times, at least, to be able to fully understand all the ramifications, and particularly with the books that you reference to. And any articles that you've written, I know you have a slew of them, but ones you are particularly proud of, we'd be glad to incorporate in the description on our YouTube channel. Michael has allowed that to be made available to the public. So it'll be on the public as well as the members only site. And anybody can go to YouTube, Svims YouTube, and you should be able to pick it up. Stephen, are you still there? Steve? Steve?
Hi, David.
Hi. We should put that on the end of the bio that we'll put out. Stephen has been doing all our editing and an excellent job. So we should be able to get this up and running within the week. Hopefully, Steve. I know you've got a lot of commitments with Cowichan and the Mushroom Show. If there are
David.
If there are no other questions, thank you, Michael. Excellent. All right. And I'm sure if anybody has some thoughts about what they would have liked to have asked and didn't, please let me know and I'll email it to Michael. He gets enough emails from me, like all of you.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Michael. And I'll
yeah.
give,
Yeah, I want to ask one question. Michael, are you a member of the club?
no.
No, I'm not.
Okay,
I'm not
but
the Vancouver one. Yeah.
okay, so if we do have questions out later, because I know that I got some digesting to do before I can find the one also that I want to ask. Do I contact David or Shannon perhaps in the club to then forward it on
Just
to you?
send it to me and I'll pass it on to Michael.
Sure, that'd be great.
Awesome,
All right.
thank you.
Yeah, I'll sign up for your club for sure.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thanks so much.
All the best,
Appreciate it.
guys.
Yeah.
Have a great evening and a great Thanksgiving.
Thank
All
you.
the best.
Thanks.
Michael, I'll give you a call in a moment. There's
Okay,
a
great.
couple of things I need to discuss.
Okay, great.
Super. Good night, everybody. All the best.